All right, y'all. So, welcome back. I wanted to delve back into the first resource that we started looking into with regard to slave medicine for quote unquote African Americans, foundational Black Americans at the time of chattel slavery here in North America. I want to point out some pretty important things with regards to this text to make sure that things are in proper place and express a few of my issues with it. But starting here, this is chapter 1. It's important to note that the immigration of Europeans and Africans to North and Central America introduced new diseases to the region. Mind you, there were already populations of black or dark skinned individuals, brown skinned individuals, tawny hued individuals living, thriving, utilizing plants and systems, ethnobotanical systems of medicine with the plants and the flora and fauna here long before these people came over through the violent institution of the slave trade and so-called discovery and exploration, right? Keep that in mind. Now, as we move along, because like I said, I really want to comb through this resource, highlight some things to give a general kind of explanation and framing before we delve into deeply and get more detailed. So it's important to note that with reference to a lot of these WPA narratives or the quote unquote slave narratives, again, that you can find at the Library of Congress on their website, that there are limitations and shortcomings in that. And I've kind of touched on some of that in some of the other videos. So again, you'll want to watch this series from beginning to end. Also, I do just want to state that many of the opinions that I'm sharing, actually all of the opinions that I'm sharing in these videos are my own. They do not reflect any of the people, any of the businesses that I work with, or any other practitioners that I work with. They're my viewpoints and my opinions, and I have a right to those and to my own beliefs, okay? Also, I really appreciate this section where they kind of explain the terminology that they're employing in this particular work. And I think it's important to note, that when they're referencing the enslaved or slave, they're referring to any person of African ancestry who was forced into involuntary servitude. Okay, they're not referring in these definitions of natives who would be forced into this same institution, which I think is horrible. And then also, but I understand, this work is very intricate and difficult, and it's a lot. So I'm not saying it's horrible to degrade or take away from what they've compiled and the research that they've done with reference to these people in particular. I think it's a wonderful thing, but horrible in the sense that it's not holistic, and it really, again, completely flattens and hides and erases a very true reality that those of African ancestry, again, the small percentage, 3%, that were brought over to North America to then intermix and amalgamate with those already here, native to the land, red and brown natives, and also, unfortunately through abuse and assault, Europeans to make foundational Black Americans. Those native ancestors that were, again, a part of this, forced into involuntary servitude, are not framed that way in this work. And so to me, that's horrible, because this is one of the foundational works to ethnobotany when it concerns quote unquote Black people, when it concerns what was employed and practiced by foundational Black Americans. And we do have to acknowledge, again, that under this umbrella of BIPOC, all melanated people kind of tend to get clumped in together, smushed together. And by doing that, it completely convolutes and really makes null and void the important differences and experiences and knowledge that these people went through and that they have, and how they've contributed to a lot of the systems that we see today that fall under this umbrella of Western herbalism and, again, even biomedicine. And so when they're speaking of white or whites, and they, double down on that it's solely African origin or heritage. And again, this term in and of itself is so vague, right? Because we know that on the continent of Africa, you have thousands of ethnic groups. And at that particular time, with the nation states involved in the trading, the selling of prisoners of war and many of their own people into this, chattel slave system, how those people identified what clans or chiefdoms or tribes they were a part of, we don't know, right? So when referring to white or whites, it's not just people of European ancestry, which I thought was really interesting, but Native American. So it's almost like they're honoring the reality that many Europeans brought their ways onto the different roads, which honestly, this phenomenon kind of would have come after a lot of the time that this earlier knowledge is explored. But yeah, so very interesting to me, but very important to point out, because they're letting you know this is how we're employing this language here, and language matters, right? It literally states meaning and what we are going to be reading. So we got to keep that in mind. So a lot of what's going to be explored with regard to Native American, and then we'll see, and I'm going to go into that, and even European contributions to herbalism are going to be revered or framed as being white or European, which is inaccurate. It's inaccurate, especially because we understand that much of the knowledge Europeans would have in the formation of Western herbalism from like the 1st century, and we've seen that with works like Dioscorides and Pliny, much of that knowledge came from the Hebrews, darker races of people that have direct ties to biblical bloodlines descending from Shem, who was given the knowledge of the plants of the earth to preclude the demons from causing sickness and disease, and disseminated, out to, but I believe kind of stolen and corrupted by the other nations of people. And that informed whatever work a lot of these people compiled, right? And so just to kind of quickly read this overview, again, I feel comfortable reading this AI overview because we've already looked into a lot of these records, many of them, and we will be going more in depth in the future. But again, as we can see with Dioscorides, we'll get into Galen, I believe is how you say that, and some others. But yeah, during this Greco-Roman time, we've already seen where much of this information, and in the published translated works themselves, can be accredited to darkly complected, darker hued people. So none of this knowledge is originally quote unquote white at all. It isn't at all. And I think that's interesting how, they don't really specify the racial categorization of these individuals enslaved, but they do of those in the dominant society or perpetuating the crimes. Yeah, a lot of issues I have with the way that they've framed a lot of this stuff, but it is what it is. It is what it is. All right. Yeah, so we kind of went into this understanding that, there are two different systems, essentially, or types, rather, branches of folk medicine, that being natural folk medicine. The second, this sort of magical religious folk medicine that has this sort of syncretic nature of combining elements from different spiritualistic systems, especially those practiced in Africa, with whatever was naturally here, and also, other things with relation to the occult, and a lot of holy elements that would be integrated as well from the faith-based healing that a lot of our people employed prior to the exposure or outside of the exposure to this sort of information. Okay. So they go on further to kind of explain the different kinds of healers, and to say that with this particular typology, it encompasses other terms And though historians and cultural anthropologists rely on these to classify African American folk practitioners, it's important to kind of speak to some of the distinctions and nuance in that, and situating these practices properly. And that's really what they kind of want to highlight here, is this sort of hoodoo voodoo reality that, again, was not indicative of all of the ways that our people, we can even read of many instances in the WPA narratives of this truth, not all of the ways that our people employed plants and their faith and prayer for healing. All right. And so the book is, really just focused on, and I would even say more so, the Africanist centric sort of perspective when it comes to the folk practices. Now, there was something else that they stated. Let me see if I can find it, that I really appreciated. One moment here, y'all. Y'all forgive me. I cannot find that section. It'll come back to me. But I do also want to make mention of a few things that I've highlighted in addition to what we've gone over. So I appreciate that they acknowledge that many of these interviews were conducted during the 1930s. So we have to understand the ethnogenesis that has happened by this point in time. And that, really being reflective of a people with mixtures that are not solely African and not majority African at that point. And again, I don't believe, that's one of my theories that I'm looking to prove, that many of those Africans specifically brought over straight to North America were at the time of being taken captive continental African or belonging to those nation states. I think in a way they were passing through. And so, we really have to be careful with how we're framing that. Let me see. Yeah, and it is important, because this proves the claim that when it comes to our ethnobotanical and ethnomedical systems, especially here in North America and the world over in prehistory and antiquity even, those practices employed 9 times out of 10, 9.5 times out of 10 by darker skinned, darker hued people who would in this system be categorized as Black, were employed by those people and informed the science-based medicine, and continues to, in all reality, that we have today, laying the very foundation. Okay. All right, we read this. Let's see. And yeah, we're gonna look deeper into this. We've already begun to with the history of pharmacy, and like I mentioned in that video, we're gonna go into pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, how our bodies react to the drugs, how the drugs react to our bodies. Essentially, is the difference between those two sort of areas of study within general pharmacology. I don't know much about it. I know enough. I think, there's so much to learn that, when it comes to pharmacology, that stuff gets very intricate. Biomedicine, period. It is a lot of information to learn and to go into. But I'm always just looking at what is applicable and important for bridging that gap between CAM, or complementary and alternative medicine, with, these biomedical fields of study. So we'll go into some of that, also clearing up a lot of this idea that when it comes to what knowledge and practices were employed by Europeans in this formation of Western herbalism that would transform here in North America, because of the foundation laid by the natives here and those brought over. Even a lot of that is still not this sort of quote unquote white invention. Okay. nor originating from the so-called fathers or progenitors of these systems or knowledge. All right, and so these centuries are going to be really important, for us to delve into, but I believe 15th and 16th as well, and 17th, obviously, precursor to all of this to lay the groundwork, but just in regards to the physicians, and most of what they were employing and practicing at that time, like mentioned before in other videos, were some what many would consider torturous techniques of bloodletting, being poisoned, cupping, what have you. And the way cupping is employed now, in different systems, I think is different with respect to the primary ethnic groups that utilize this in a different kind of way, in a skillful way, and there can be benefit to that for some people. But we have to understand the inhumanity that was practiced by those at this particular time within this context of what was going on and, on our people, on many of our ancestors, these sorts of things. All right. Okay. Let's see how much time I got, y'all. All right. Yeah. So we know that is true. And so, yeah, there's this idea again that medical use of herbal remedies was entrenched in Western medicine centuries long before the colonization of North America. Europeans generally believed that every illness had a corresponding herbal treatment, and that only one needed to link the correct plant with the specific ailment. In addition, Europeans generally thought the plant characteristics such as shape, size, color helped reveal what illnesses that plant was useful in treating. And what we'll come to learn is that this is not some exclusive European discovery or recognition. No. This knowledge of these things and the truth of many of these things was stolen in many cases and taught to these people, again, by quote unquote black folk. All right. Yeah, and then they get, kind of specific into different plants that were introduced to North America. And also those, native here that were utilized by some of the Europeans as well as our ancestors. And so we'll pull into that, and we'll start delving back into a lot of those early colonists and explorers and plant hunter journals, to see truly what plants were here, the flora and fauna over here, because it was way more abundant than a lot of people let on. Very integral to the medical systems of the Black natives. All right, so much of the success that they garnered was from the usage of a lot of the plants that the quote-unquote enslaved, employed to heal themselves, and that they even used in their own healing. Then they go on to the Native American contributions to the pharmacopoeia, or materia medica as well. They do, at least acknowledge that there was a lot of amalgamating between the natives and Africans brought over. And y'all, I am so sorry. I cannot seem to find. It'll come back to me. We'll explore it in another portion of this. The point that I was trying to make earlier. But yeah, it's just in the curriculum, in the lexicon right now, the way that these people and their contributions are situated, and the very things that influence and the very people that influence their knowledge is not correct. It is not holistic. It's not right. And it's not a matter of not having enough information to do that. No. We've got enough information. There's just a deliberate effort to reframe and to whitewash, unfortunately, and erase history and the truth of history and just how integral our people truly are to the healing of many nations, not just North America. So, yeah. Very, very interesting stuffs. But all right, I'm going to end the video here. We don't have much time left. Let me see. Oh, what's going on? One moment. So yeah, I'm going to end this video soon, but I did want to kind of read into this. So in general, formal medical care was not available routinely in the antebellum South, except for wealthy whites. Even when it was available, formal medical care was not particularly effective. Given some of the misdirected medical practices of the period, such as excessive bleeding, the unavailability of medical care was not always a negative thing. A number of formal treatments were more harmful than helpful to the patient. Physicians equally applied depletion and other theories to whites, and I don't know that that was actually equal. I wouldn't necessarily say that. And, foundational Black Americans. And so, given the harm and pain inflicted, it should come as no surprise that many whites and enslaved people distrusted formerly trained physicians. They saw them as not serving the common folks and as being expensive. Further confounding the situation was the absence of clear boundaries between traditional medicine and lay or domestic practices. Saying that little separated them and both borrowed extensively from each other, which I also don't believe that this is necessarily true. Because we know that even the tools and things needed to employ a lot of what they were, those enslaved weren't practicing these things on themselves or each other. They were sticking to the sort of domestic or lay practices because they're calling traditional medicine these sorts of things and homeopathy, which is kind of flipped from how we know it today. Traditional tends to be, the herbal, still homeopathy too. Not so much, I don't think, what informed early pharmacy, apothecary, and all that type of stuff. But maybe that all does fall in. But they are making a distinction here between that and lay and domestic practice. Because I would consider those lay and domestic practices traditional. You get what I'm saying? Hopefully you understand what I'm saying. But yeah. So a lot we got to clear up even with this, statement. Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of surprised. I thought this work was a little more thorough, but I'm learning that is not necessarily the case. And again, this is a pretty hefty endeavor to undertake. Kudos to them for even compiling and putting this together with the research and sources that they have. But the framing, the use of terminology, and the lack of information, the omission of information, and not including certain things, I think is harmful and kind of surprising. Because I'm like, what? There's a lot to be corrected, in this record. And again, I'm no expert, but when you're exposed to more knowledge, when you're exposed to differing viewpoints, and you can weigh those matters and discern and make informed, educated decisions to a much better, more holistic conclusion, then you do that. I mean, you know better, you kind of do better, And that's what studying to me and researching is all about. When you're analyzing documents, it's about filtering it through other sources, even ones that challenge a lot of the beliefs that are being purported, and which one does a better job at proving many different theories, or facts. So, yeah, there was something else. What else? No, that's where I stopped. I gotta go through the rest of these pages. But anyway, you will all be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share. Thank y'all for tuning in. We're going to keep the ball rolling. Like I stated, I am working on the first course that's going to be offered on this YouTube channel with just sort of an introduction to ethnobotanical medicine, clinical herbalism, and clarifying a few of the theories that I'm presenting with the work that I do, and also different plant families and the common ailments, which will be a different portion but I do want to briefly speak to just a few because it's a very prevalent issue that's on the rise within our community that are impacting our people, and how plants really can play a significant role in helping us to maintain wellness, prevent disease, and manage chronic illness. So, again, thank y'all for tuning in, and y'all be blessed.